Open your Bibles, if you will, to Exodus, the 15th chapter. We will be studying today, beginning with the last few verses in chapter 15, and then we'll be taking a look at some events in chapter 16, 17, and 18 as we continue our study of the book of Exodus, the goodness and severity of God. We begin our study at Marah. Here we read in chapter 15 and verse 22, "So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And then they came to Marah. They could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people murmured against Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' Verse 25 we read, 'And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast in the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them.'" And that's kind of where we want to begin this morning, is this idea of proving, because the title of this lesson is He Proved Them. This is something we see several times in this section, and we see it throughout the wilderness journey. That is, that the Lord is set about to prove his people, to test them, to try them. He's been focused up to this time on Egypt, on the judgments against Egypt, on delivering his people from Egypt. And now the focus is turned to the children of Israel to prepare them for serving him, to prepare them for the promised land, to see if they will indeed be faithful to him and do what it is that he wanted them to do. Here they murmured against Moses and said, "What shall we drink?" And the Lord provided. Here I've shown a translation also of the English Standard Version, and I use that translation because as we look at the other passages in this section and some other passages from the Old Testament, the English Standard Version does a good job of translating the same Hebrew word consistently as test or tested. The King James sometimes uses the word tempt and some other words in addition to proving. So I've selected the English Standard Version and the idea of testing. The true meaning of this word is to assess the value of something, to see if it is indeed genuine, to see if it will be worthy of what it claims to be. I oftentimes think of proving and that terminology when I think of a meter. When we think of a meter, we might think of something that all of us have seen, and that's the pump at a gas station. You know, you put your credit card in, or you give the cashier some money, and you say you want 10 gallons of gas, and you stick it in your car, the nozzle in your car, and you turn it on, and the little meter reads up and says you got 10 gallons. How do you know that you have 10 gallons? How do you know that that's an honest weight, that that's giving you exactly what you're being charged for? Well, if you ever look on a gas pump, there's little stickers there that show that the pump has been certified. And the way literally they do that is by proving that meter. They'll bring out a very careful gauge, and periodically from time to time they'll stop by randomly at various gas stations, and they'll pump 1 gallon of gas into this gauge and see if indeed the pump is giving 1 gallon. That's how you prove a meter. You show that it is genuine, that it's giving what it's supposed to give. At the time this was written, and the time we read about in the New Testament of words such as prove or assay or test or genuine, the idea is of testing a metal to see if the metal was really the gold or the silver, to see if a coin was indeed gold or silver or was made from some other metal and simply had a coating of gold and silver. They would prove the metal. They would prove the coin to say that it was genuine. Here the Lord is testing his people to see if they're really his people. Up until now, we've read who is going to be the people of God. Now we're going to see what they are supposed to do. We're going to see if they indeed will be the people of God, if they will follow God as he wants them to follow him. The idea of proving is used several times in this context and throughout Scripture. Here we see it accompanying the actions of Israel in regards to the situation they find themselves in as they're traveling to Mount Sinai. We see they show up at Marah, and there's bitter water there, and the Lord heals that water. The Lord makes that water sweet. We'll see in the next chapter that they hunger, and the Lord provides for them manna and quail. We'll see in the next chapter they thirst, and God again provides for them water. Each of these times, the children of Israel murmur. Each of these times, we're told the Lord is testing them. Or in one case, where they test the Lord. Same word, same idea. Exodus 16:4 says that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. That's where they are asking for food. That's where they say that they've been brought out into the desert to die from starvation. That's where they say, we wish that we were in Egypt because there we sat by flesh pots. We had all the meat we wanted, and we did eat bread to the full. Now think about this. These are the children of Israel who cried to the Lord because of their rigorous bondage, because of the situation they were in. And now, a few days out into the desert, in this case, after the Lord has already provided for them water, they call for food. We'll see more on this in a moment. But here he says that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. Then in chapter 17, there we come to the situation where they come and they have no water to drink in Rephidim, and they chide Moses, or they quarrel with Moses. They're contentious with Moses. And Moses looks at them and say, why do you do this? Why do you test the Lord? And in verse 7, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? They were testing the Lord. They were putting the Lord to the trial. They were proving whether or not the Lord was going to be with them. But imagine this people asking, is the Lord among us or not? After all they had seen, after all they had been through. As I said, in each of these cases, they murmured. In each of these cases, the Lord heard them. In each of these cases, the Lord provided for them. But in doing so, he also tested them to see if they were going to follow him. And we'll see in chapter 20 and verse 20, whereas they're before Mount Sinai, that Moses says, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. God's goal is to help them understand, to help them mature, to help them have faith in him, to help them walk in his law, and that they might not sin. If we look elsewhere in the Old Testament, we see a number of passages that help us to see this. Deuteronomy 6:16. You shall not put the Lord your God to test, as you tested him in Massah. Jesus quoted this passage when he's going through his temptation. And he says, again it is written, you shall not put the Lord your God to test. Powerful passage for us to think about and realize that as we look to God and strive to do something different than what he has told us, as we have an attitude of what's best for me may not be what God wants, but I want what I want, are we putting God to the test? Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. As Moses is looking back on this journey, as he's looking back on some of these very incidents, he says that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. There's that idea of following his commandments or not, but notice it's more than just that. It's what was in their heart, because indeed their heart is evident. The condition of their heart is evident in their actions. Think about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart and how we could see what really was in Pharaoh's heart by what he decided to do, by the decisions he made. Here, the Lord is testing to see what was in their heart and to see if they would keep his commandments or not. We'll see that again here in a moment. Deuteronomy 8 and 16, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. It wasn't just to test them, but it was to a purpose of doing what was good for them, to bring about the end result, the purpose that God wanted. In this case, to humble them that they might have faith in him, they might walk in his ways, they might follow his commandments. Psalm 78 and 18 says, they tested God in their heart by demanding the food that they crave. So again, we see this idea that they tested God, same word, but we also see that it revealed what was in their heart. See, what was in their heart was made evident by what they said and what they did. They craved food. They desired physical things. They hadn't yet learned to trust in the Lord, so they tested God by demanding what they wanted. As we've said, in each of these cases, God heard what they said and he provided for them. In the 15th chapter, the 16th chapter, and the 17th chapter, in each of these cases, he provided what they needed: sweet water, food, manna and quail, and water when they could not find water or Rephidim. But you know, he had already done this. He had already heard them before and responded to them. Remember back at the very beginning of Exodus, they cried out because of their bondage, because of their cruel bondage. They cried out because of the condition that they were in, and the Lord heard them and remembered the promise that he had made. Now you'll notice that throughout this section, God doesn't display his anger. He doesn't respond in anger in punishing the children of Israel here. He's patient with them. He shows loving kindness. He shows long suffering. I'd encourage you to read the small piece of a commentary I have there in the notes for this week from a commentary by Sarna that talks about the fact that he does not show displeasure here. He does not show his anger here. See, God is dealing with his children, and here they are immature. They have just left a place where they were in bondage, a place where everything that they did was guided by somebody else. He's brought them out into a new place, a place where they're going to have to learn his commands, his ordinances, what he wants them to do, and he shows patience with them. He shows them loving kindness and long suffering. What does Israel show? Israel shows a lust and a desire for physical things, a lack of appreciation of what God is trying to do, and impatience. But nevertheless, God is patient with them. He shows them mercy. He shows them kindness, and he tries to bring them along on this journey. Let's go back to this verse in Exodus 15:25. And let's add the next verse in, verse 26. God has proved them. He is set about to help them, to provide for them. Look at the very last couple words here in this 2 verses. I am the Lord that healeth thee. He says this right after he's made the water sweet. He said this right after he's provided for them. He's telling them, I have the ability to bring whatever needs to be brought to bear to help you, to heal you, to provide for you. You're going to want for nothing. But notice what else it says here in this section. Notice the words that I have highlighted here: statute, ordinance, commandment, and then statute again. Yours may say rule for one of these. We'll see later on the word law is used. We haven't even got to Sinai yet in this journey. And yet it says here the Lord is laying down a statute and an ordinance for them. He's making that for them. Now what is this? That they follow his will, that they do what it is he tells them to do. He's trying to bring across this idea of the importance of them following his will. Now, by comparison, we could go back and look at an ordinance in chapter 12 and verse 24. You remember last week we talked about the Passover. And remember it said this would be an ordinance for you and all your generations. And they were to teach it to their children. See, the Lord has been giving them rules. He's been giving them laws. He's been giving them guidance. Part of it all the way back to the patriarchs and before. And we'll see some of that as we get into the next sections of Exodus. Here we see him giving them other ordinances and statutes and commands. Now the same word that is translated here, for instance, as ordinance, as a rule, is the same one that's translated in chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, where it talks about, you remember, Moses went to Pharaoh and said, let the people go. And Pharaoh said, well, y'all must be idle because you want to go worship your God. So therefore, they increased their task. They had them make bricks without straw. The word that is translated in most translations as task there, that was laid upon them, is this same word, this ordinance. And you can appreciate that. You can understand that when you're given an order, when you're given a command, when you're given a task to do, there's an expectation that you do it. And that's the same thing that's brought about here. And I just think it's ironic that we see that they had a task that they had to fulfill, and they knew what would happen if they didn't follow that task under the oppression of Egypt. Here, the Lord is giving them things to do as well. And he's going to see if they indeed will do those things, if they will fulfill what he's asked for them to do. So he lays out this idea of statute, ordinance. If you go to the end of this section in Exodus 18, verses 16 and 20, we read, here as Jethro is talking to Moses, Moses says, when they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between the one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his laws. So he's talking about the statutes and laws. And again, this is before Sinai. He's telling them what it is that God expects of them. There'll be more laws given to them at Sinai. There'll be more laws given to them in regards to the tabernacle. There'll be all these additional laws that come on, but there were already ordinances, there were rules, there was guidance given by God. And then as Jethro looks at Moses to tell him what it is that he should do in distributing the responsibility of judging the people, he says, and thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, using the same words, and shall show them the way wherein they must walk and the work they must do. This idea of the responsibility, the task that they had, was to follow God and what he had asked for them to do. So throughout this whole section, while we might talk about the example of the manna, of the other things they were commanded to do in this section, or as we go back to previous lessons and talk about Passover, Or we talk about, in this section, the Sabbath and the keeping of the Sabbath as they were to collect the manna. Or we might talk about something back under the patriarchs as circumcision. Or something we see in chapter 18 when Jethro and Moses and Aaron are there and sacrifices are offered to the Lord. Sacrifice. We see all these things were ordinances, were laws, were rules that had been given to God's people, and in this case to the children of Israel, that they were to keep. And so the Lord reminds us of these things and tells us that's what their purpose was to give them to the children of Israel so that they might know how to walk, to follow him. But you notice there's more in these verses than just the statutes, laws, and ordinances. Notice what Moses said. When they would come to him and he had to make a judgment one to another, he would make them know the statutes of God. His goal was to teach them, was to help them, was to help them to know what it was they were supposed to do. Not just to tell them the law, but to help them understand it so that they might mature, so that they might walk in the appropriate way in following God. The same thing when Jethro responds back to him and says, "Thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do." So it was more than just telling them the law, it was showing them how to keep the law. Whether it be the example last week of the Passover and the great detail that was given to the children of Israel on how to keep the Passover, or whether it's in this section when he talks about the manna and what it was they were supposed to do in gathering up the manna and all the peculiarities of that, how that if they gathered too much, they would not have any left over. If they gathered too little, they would have enough. Or if they tried to keep some over on a day they weren't supposed to, we see the example of what happened there, except on the Sabbath. And how on the Sabbath they were not to gather. So they were to gather twice as much the day before so that they would have some for the Sabbath and it would not stink. It would not have maggots and worms. But instead, because it was for the Sabbath and because they were keeping God's will, the work that they would do would yield what God wanted to have done. And we could look at a whole host of things about manna and the other examples in this section. But I think the emphasis needs to be here on not only the law and him proving them whether they'll follow the law, but how he was going about teaching them and helping them to understand the law. We read earlier from Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 2. I'm going to read chapter 8 verses 2 and 3 here. "And thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou would keepest his commandments or not. And he humbled thee, and suffered thee to hunger, and fed thee with manna, which thou knewest not, neither did thy fathers know, that he might make thee know that man doth not live by bread only, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of the Lord doth man live." So you see, his purpose here in doing all the things we read about in these a little over 3 chapters was to humble them. He allowed them to get hungry, and then he fed them with manna, something which, remember, they went out and asked, "What is it?" They had never seen anything like this. Their fathers had never known anything like this. It was something very unique. And it's interesting as you read the commentaries on this and all the men who try to struggle to find a way to explain the things that happen to the children of Israel by natural means, this is one of those things that they can't explain. They can't explain it in terms of how it was presented as a dew that fell from heaven or between the dew that fell from heaven. They can't explain how any substance would look like or taste like the things that they have there. Men have tried. They've claimed there's things out in the desert that are resin from plants or from certain insects but everyone admits that it could not be in near the volume that would be needed for this group of people. And it doesn't taste like or look like the things that is described here. Truly, we don't understand what manna was. Truly, we don't understand much more than what we read about it here. And in some cases, we don't really understand that because what is used to explain it to us is not something that's even familiar with us today. But notice one of the things which the Lord told Moses to do, and that was to gather up some, to put it in a storage so that it would be there forever for the children of Israel to see. It didn't stink. It didn't breed worms. It was that which was to prove what God had done in the desert. Because you see, this was only there for a particular period of time. It wasn't going to be forever. It was for a particular period of time to help the children of Israel, to show mercy and love to the children of Israel, but also to teach them, to humble them, to allow them to see how they needed to depend upon God and they needed to walk in all his ways. The purpose was to bring them to a greater understanding of the Lord, to a greater appreciation of the Lord, to mature in their relationship with God and to be pleasing to God. Now, as we think about this idea of the manna, and we know what God had provided, he was not going to provide manna on the Sabbath. And that goes back all the way to Genesis and his idea of the rest on the seventh day. And he told them that was going to happen. And yet, what did the children of Israel do? Some of them went out and looked for manna on the Sabbath. That's what we read in chapter 16 and verse 27. And notice what the Lord says in 16 and 28. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? There's those two words again, commandments and laws. Now think about this. Here's a person who 6 days has done what the Lord has asked him to do, we could presume. And on the seventh day, out of habit, he goes out there again. And the Lord was not pleased with that. The Lord looked at Moses and said, in regards to really all of them, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? What was laid down before them was very clear. And we're going to see how they respond to this. We're going to see with time, God's long suffering comes to an end and he finds himself in places punishing the children of Israel and ultimately punishing them all in a way for their wandering for 40 years because they provoke him finally too many times. That's how they respond. Let me ask you, how do we respond? Think about this phrase right here. Think about it in your life. How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? The law concerning manna in the wilderness was pretty simple, and yet some would not follow it for whatever reason. The laws that God gives us today are pretty simple, and yet some of us choose not to follow them for whatever reason. Do you think the Lord is any more pleased today in those who disobey his law, who refuse to keep his commandments, than he was back at the time of Moses as the children were wandering in the desert of Sinai? Let's go back to chapter 15 again. We've already looked at this verse once, but I want to look at it from a little different point of view. And said, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, to keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. He provided for them whenever they had need. He gave them commandments and laws, statutes. He taught them his will. And what did he ask of them in return? Well, we see it here. to diligently hearken, to do what is right, to give ear to his commandments, to keep all his statutes. Now, I've selected here the King James because your translation may simply say at the beginning of this, to listen to the voice of the Lord. The word is stronger here. Have you ever been with somebody and you know they can hear you with their ears, but they're not paying attention to what you're saying? That's not what the Lord wants. The Lord doesn't simply want us to listen to him. The Lord wants us to diligently, with effort, hearken, that is, take heed and obey his voice. To obey him. Now notice how he's repeat these thoughts in this verse. And will do that which is right. To obey, take heed, listen with a purpose, listen to follow, to do not just anything, not what you think is right, but do what is right in his sight. So obey, do what is right, give ear to his commandments. You know, in the New Testament we're told, he that hath an ear to hear, let him hear. That's the idea here. Give ear to his commandments. In other words, pay attention to his commandments. You could translate this as listen to his commandments, as give full attention to his commandments, and keep, not a part of the law, but all the law, all of his statutes. Diligently hearken, do what is right, give ear to his commandments, keep all. Obey, do, hear, keep. That kind of sums up this whole section. Here in this verse at the end of chapter 15, after we've looked at the idea of proving, after we've talked about them murmuring, as we've talked about his law, we kind of see a summation of what it is they were supposed to do. Follow his will. And we can see that in regards to the murmuring. Did they listen to God? Did they do what was right by murmuring, by chiding Moses, by threatening to stone him, as Moses says in chapter 17? No. Did they keep his law in regards to the manna? Well, some of them did, but some of them obviously didn't, and that God was not pleased with, and asked the simple question, how long will you refuse to follow my commandments? Well, let's look at a couple other comparisons in this section and think about what they teach us and what they help us to understand regarding God's will. Let's look at the two places we read about at the end of Exodus 15. Marah, which we've already talked about in regards to the bitter water, but look at the very end of chapter 15 and see they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the waters. No problem there, no murmuring there. It was a pleasant, you might say like a paradise. It was probably an oasis in the desert. And no matter how sparse it might have been, it was much better than the land around it. And they obviously had plenty of water there, and they probably had plenty to eat there, because with all the palm trees, there were undoubtedly probably other vegetation there, not to mention dates and other things like that they could eat. How do we look at life? Do we look at life as Marah or as Elim? What do I mean by that? Do we just expect everything to work out and for us to have everything we have need of whenever we need it and wherever we want it? Elim. Or do we understand that this life is going to have difficulties? This life is going to have troubles. We're going to be tested. We're going to be tried. God's going to prove us. And we accept that and we understand it. And we're determined to prove ourselves before God in that we'll be faithful to him. Will not refuse to keep his commandments, but will strive to do what he has asked for us to do. You see, we have a contrast here between these two places, not only in how the children of Israel responded, not only in terms of what was provided there, but I think a contrast for us to think about in terms of how we look at life. We're going to have trials. We're going to have temptations. We're going to have difficulty. In the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, there's several passages there in that chapter that really harken back to this time. And we talked about some of them in the earlier lessons. But notice, especially verses 10 through 13 of 1 Corinthians 10. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed of the destroyer, talking about a later time. Now all of these things happen to them for examples, and are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Now we've talked about those verses before in our study of Exodus, but notice the next one. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it. Are we able to bear the things that we face? Well, the God has promised us that we will be able to bear what we face, just like the children of Israel were able to bear what they were experiencing. And the trials and temptations were not such that they were beyond their capability to accept them. So, well, they had Mara, however you want to pronounce it. Well, they had bitter water to deal with, and they chose to murmur. We're encouraged not to murmur and to realize the Lord will provide for us, no matter what we may be faced with. Chapter later in 1 Corinthians 11:19, we see a very specific example of the trial or the test that might come upon us. And it uses a word very similar to what we talked about as we began this study, and we talked about proving the children of Israel. 1 Corinthians 11:19, for there must also be heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. In other words, there's going to be false doctrines arise. And that's a test, and that's a trial. And those who are faithful are made obvious by how they stand up to those false doctrines, to those trials, and to those tests. Or we could look at the book of James, beginning in verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall in divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience. But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Think about that passage in regards to what we're studying here in Exodus. The trying of your faith worketh patience. Think of the patience the children of Israel had to have. But yet think of how their patience could make them perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Literally, they were in want of nothing. God was to provide for them and would provide for them all they have need of. They were to be patient. They were to follow him. They were to diligently hearken, to do what is right, to give ear to his commandments, and to keep all his statutes. Well, that could be a comparison between those two stops in chapter 15. Or we might compare the difference between those who were not of the children of Israel that came in contact with the children of Israel in chapter 17 and chapter 18. In chapter 17, we read of the Amalekites and how they came to do battle with the children of Israel. And we know the story, and we know the story of Joshua and how this is where Joshua led the children of Israel. This was their first battle. This was their first test. We know that they prevailed by God's power. They prevailed as Moses held his arms up. And they even needed to help Moses to keep his arms up so the children of Israel could prevail. But we see this group of people who were descendant from Abraham, who were descendant from the same first patriarch, who ultimately would have been taught many of the things which the other children and descendants of Abraham would have been taught. But these people came and chose to fight against the children of God. And they'll be condemned later in Scripture for this. Or we got the example of Jethro, again, coming from the lineage of Abraham, a descendant of Abraham, as a Midianite. What does he do? He comes before the children of Israel. He hears what they say. And notice what it says in chapter 18 and verse 9. And Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians, and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. And it goes on and says that they took burnt offering and sacrifices and offered them to God. So we see two individuals who were not Israelites here. And we're going to see throughout their wilderness journey, throughout their conquest of Canaan, we're going to see both of these attitudes demonstrated by those that are without. On the one hand, those which will accept them and will learn from them and will acknowledge that the things which have been seen of God prove that he is God, and those who simply will fight against the children of Israel, who will be rebellious against God. In this case, the God of Abraham, the God of their ancestor, the one who had been revealed to them undoubtedly down through their generations. Now let's look near the end of our chapters today in Exodus 18. And this is after Jethro has come and visited with Moses. This is the second day when he sees Moses judging the children of Israel and busy all day in doing it. And Jethro advises him that he should select men, take men out of the children of Israel to judge in smaller matters, to judge in lesser things, to be judges, as it says there, of over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens, to rulers, as it says in some translations. The idea being those who would manage the day-to-day activity, so Moses didn't need to do everything. And of course, as Jethro gives this advice, he says, if this thing be pleasing to God, if God command thee to do this, then do it. But notice what he does here. He says, moreover, that thou provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of 10. Notice the qualifications he lays out here. Able men, men who can do the job. We talked in a previous verse here about, in the New Testament, us being able to withstand temptation, able to do what the Lord has asked us to do. That's the kind of men the Lord wanted to serve in this case, such that fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness. And notice here, men of truth shall not bear false witness. Where does that command come from? From a couple chapters after this. Comes from Mount Sinai, among the 10 Commandments. Hating covetousness, thou shalt not covet, comes from a later period of time. Again, Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments. And I selected this for a couple reasons. One was to once again show the laws and the statutes and the ordinances and the rules and commandments that had been given to the children of Israel. It's not that they were a lawless people that didn't know God's will before they got to Mount Sinai. They received much at Mount Sinai. They received very great detail regarding the law at Mount Sinai. But God expected them to be godly people. Think of all the way back to Cain and Abel. We see sacrifice offered. We see Noah offering sacrifice. We see Abraham offering sacrifice. So when Jethro and Moses offer sacrifice here in the 18th chapter, it's consistent with what the patriarchs have done. Now, the details that we read about later with the children of Israel in regards to the sacrifices they're supposed to offer are going to come on Mount Sinai. They're going to be reiterated on Mount Sinai. But we see it occurring long before they get to Sinai. We see the expectation that men would tell the truth, that they would hate covetousness, that the best among God's people would keep his will, keep his statute, keep his ordinance, walk in his ways, and that's who God wants to serve him. This was a recommendation that came from Jethro. This was something he encouraged Moses to do. As we come to the end of the lesson today, I want you to think about a few things here. I'd encourage you, first of all, to read Psalm 78. There's a lot in that passage, in that psalm, that talks about this specific period of time, as well as other teachings about the children of Israel. I'd encourage you to read that. But I'd also encourage you to think about how often each of us realize that others may see more clearly what we should do. Jethro saw something here that Moses, the servant of God, the man of God, the one who was leading the children of Israel, saw something that he could do better. And Moses listened to him. How often do we listen to others around us who tell us because they can see more clearly what we should be doing? How well do we listen to God's word? Or do we, as the children of Israel, some of them were accused of, refuse to keep the commandment of God? How well do we listen to others who are trying to help us? What's important in this section is what God said to the people, what God expected the people to do, and how the people responded. We see God's attitude, his loving kindness, his long-suffering, his mercy, his providential care. And we see a people who are growing, hopefully, towards greater faith in God. A people that need to be humbled, a people that need to suffer in order to learn, in order to be taught, in order to understand God's will for them. I'd leave you with the question that God asked Moses as a challenge to us all at all times. How long will we refuse to keep God's will? It's a powerful lesson for us from this section of Exodus. It's a powerful lesson for us in our life. So I said I'd encourage you to read through this section. We didn't cover everything. Think about the things that are taught herein. I'd encourage you to read Psalm 78 as well as some of the other passages I have listed on the notes that we didn't get a chance to cover today. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your time. May God bless you.